I am Jamie Allen Black, CEO of the Jewish Women's Foundation of New York, and I thank you all for joining us today. Welcome back to our monthly Crown Jewel Conversation series, where we learn from and interact with our grantee partners. We call them Jewels, Jewish entrepreneurial women, executives, and leaders, women who lead organizations addressing today's most pressing issues around the world, in and beyond the Jewish community. JWFNY supports social innovation and gender equity. We promote excellence in philanthropy and believe a philanthropist can have $10 or $10 million to give. The key is her intentionality around her charitable giving. And we promote excellence in women's leadership. Our 25 years of experience in supporting philanthropists and grant making has led to the work we're doing today, supporting visionary Jewish women social entrepreneurs and leaders. When you support JWFNY, you're supporting 30 different organizations run by extraordinary women, one of whom you'll meet today. Sometimes our program is mistaken as leadership development or yet another training opportunity, but what we actually do is leadership acknowledgement and advancement. We're introducing you to cutting-edge feminist leaders. The Jewish Women's Foundation of New York is where women's leadership is valued. And one of the pillars of our work is to identify women not necessarily known to the broader Jewish community and introduce them to an entirely new group of potential donors, supporters, hiring committees, board members, etc. And we do this throughout the year, but our conversation today will allow you to get to know one of these incredible women in more depth. Viviana Waisman is the CEO and founder of Women's Link Worldwide, an organization committed to fighting gender justice wherever it happens. Women's Link works on a variety of gender-related topics: sexual and reproductive rights, trafficking of human beings, discrimination and violence against women, and much, much more. Women's Link uses the power of the law to promote social change and advance the human rights of women and girls. If you share Viviana's passion for elevating the women furthest from accessing justice, you are in the right place. We offer these sessions at no cost to you, but if you find value in what we're doing, we hope you'll consider 2 donations. One to Women's Link Worldwide directly, so Viviana can continue her invaluable work, and then please consider matching that donation with one to JWFNY. We are the only organization providing these visionary, innovative, entrepreneurial leaders with the platform to broaden and deepen their base of knowledge and support. We'll put links in the chat and in a follow-up email tomorrow. During the session, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll do our best to get to all of them. We've muted everyone to avoid background noise, so the chat feature is the best way to make sure your message is seen. And now I'm thrilled to introduce the president of the Jewish Women's Foundation of New York, Rachel Weinstein.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you so much. And welcome, Viviana. I'm so looking forward to our conversation today. You have had such a remarkable career, and congratulations. You've just celebrated 20 years of Women's Link Worldwide, which is just remarkable, and can't wait to hear all about your work. And I thought we could begin a little bit with your own personal journey. Your background, your career trajectory, and what led you to found Women's Link Worldwide.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Jamie. Thank all of you. Thank you all for being here. It's really quite an honor for me to get an opportunity to share this space with all of you, everybody's busy lives. I have a hard time answering that question about what led me to start Women's Link, kind of because, and I only realized this some years ago, which is that I don't think I had a choice. I'm one of those people that I think was like born to do social justice work. I have a hard time saying that because I think maybe it sounds a little bit off, but I never thought about why I started the work until some years ago in a process to become an Ashoka Fellow. They started asking me all these questions and didn't think of myself as an entrepreneur in any sort of way then. And this realizing that it's just part of who I am. And I do think that it comes from a combination of the history of my family, generations before me, but also the way that I've lived my family experience. And I come from my grandparents were all born in Eastern Europe, and they all emigrated, all four of them actually, to Argentina in between wars. And then my parents, who were born and raised in Argentina, then became refugees to the United States when I was little. And so every generation in my family has been born on a different continent. And then I kind of closed the circle with that. My daughter was actually born here in Europe, where I currently reside in Spain. So I think that I didn't realize until, it seems a little obvious now, but so I've always been very obsessed with social justice, injustices, and very obsessed with issues of migration. And it seems a little surprising that I didn't realize that that obsession basically comes from my life experience. I actually also, and for a long time I thought, I grew up in the southern border of the United States with Mexico. I grew up in San Diego, which was where my parents were for many years. And I always thought about that border experience as having been what defined me, but really it's a combination, but a lot of it has to do with our family journey and the culture in which I was brought in which also through the years, I've come to realize how much of it has to do with my identity as a Jewish woman, which also took me a really long time to realize. I think because I've lived a majority of my life in places where there's been a very small Jewish population. And so I didn't necessarily associate a lot of my values and my seeking of social justice with my Jewish heritage. I've spent a lot of my life thinking I had quite an identity crisis. The hardest question I could get asked was where I was from, because I never knew the answer to that question. And it's such a simple question, everyone always wants to know where you're from. And I think after, a significant journey, interior, a self journey, I've realized that the one thing that identifies me is being Jewish. And I think that in the last, I think it's been the last 10 years of my life has really led a lot of my growth as a person, and then so my growth professionally. So there's a lot of layers there, but I think that's my brief explanation of kind of how I landed working on social justice issues. And then in terms of women's rights, and actually, I think this is a story that I love to tell, because I think that once you see the world with a gender perspective, sometimes people say you put on gender lens glasses, you can't ever take them off again. And as I said, I've always known all my life I was going to work on social justice issues. And in my last year in college, actually, I went to undergraduate at Berkeley in California. I took a class called Women in Politics. I was a political science major. At the time, there were no tenured women faculty at the political science department at Berkeley, which was, I think, that ranked number 1 or 2 in the country at that point. And I took this woman in politics class from a woman who was an adjunct professor. And as any of you who have been educated in the United States know, that over the period of your life, you study US history many times, right? So I studied it when I was, in junior high, you studied it again in high school, and then I had studied it in college. And then all of a sudden I took this woman in politics class, which basically looked at the history of the United States from the perspective of women. And it was like, oh my God, it's a whole different story when you look at it that way. And I think that was the really just the moment in which I realized that my calling was women's rights. I think it had been building, but that's when I just realized there was just no going back for me. That's the issue that I was going to work on my entire life. So yeah, that's kind of how I got going.
It's a great story, and the fact that your family were all migrants in a way, and knowing that that's part of your work too. I mean, it makes it very personal. You're sort of like a citizen of the world, and the organization that you created services the world. So let's talk a little bit about Women's Link Worldwide. Can you talk a little bit about the mission, the areas that you serve, and sort of what are the key issue areas that you address?
Of course. So Women's Link, as Jamie said, what we do is we use the power of the law to advance the rights of women and girls. And we especially work with women and girls that are farthest from access to justice. We do this across 3 different regions in the world: Latin America, starting with what used to be an office out of Colombia, and then in Europe with what used to be an office in Spain, and then some work in East Africa. And we work on the intersecting of women's rights. So the issue areas we work on are sexual and reproductive rights, especially access to safe, legal, and dignified abortion, gender-based discrimination and how it intersects with other forms of discrimination, including migration status, race, ethnicity, poverty, and then violence, which is violence against women, which is the most extreme form of discrimination that women and girls face. And importantly, we work on how women and girls experience discrimination, which isn't set up it's not like in different areas, right? If you're a victim of sexual violence, then you will need sexual reproductive health and rights access. And so you can't work on one issue without working on the other. And really important, and I think the basis of our work and a lot of my thinking around human rights is that we work to bring those who are furthest from justice into the circle. And the way I think of it is, if you think of justice, and I'm a very visual person, so like if you think of justice as a dot, and I like the dot to be purple because it's a very feminist color. So if you think of the justice as a dot, and you think about where the population is in relation to justice, and justice is both accessing like courts, but accessing services and your fundamental human rights, including like your access to health. And you think about those circles, and we are in different places, depending on a lot of different factors. And we work with those women who are furthest away from that circle, with the idea that if you work to push those people in further, then everybody gets closest to that purple justice circle. Because and it's valid to work on different aspects of women's rights, but my fear is if you work on those who are a little further away, but there's other people that are already more marginalized, then those people get further and further away. So our efforts, and it's always in collaboration with others, obviously, is to bring all the women closer by focusing on those who are in the most marginalized situations. And that leads us to work with women who are victims of trafficking, as you mentioned, for example, or how to ensure access to abortion in restrictive settings, or how to expand the law in places where that's a possibility. And so that is the focus of our work across the regions that we are in which we're operating.
Are there any breakthrough cases that you'd like to highlight? Is there one or two that you'd like to talk about?
Picking cases is always so hard. I think that for us, and I guess I want to say this because I don't know if there are other lawyers in the room, but one of the important things for me about the way we do our work, so we do strategic litigation, which is, you use a law. And I think I want to back up for a second before talking about the cases, which is I want to say that one thing about being an attorney and using the law is the law actually tends to be used to maintain the status quo. That's like the way the law is used in society. And what we do at Women's Inc. is we work to use the law to make change. So I often think of the law, and sorry for this analogy, like a piece of gum. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to stretch it, right? We're trying to figure out how to have the law be implemented in a way that that allows women and girls to have access to it, which means that the law has to be applied with a gender perspective. And I'm sorry, I'll get to answering your question, but I think it's important to think about what it means to work with a law with a gender perspective, because I think a lot of times there is a lack of understanding, not in this group of people, but in general in the world, that working on women's rights and gender is a specialization. So I sometimes say, for example, if you are arrested for something, God forbid, you wouldn't call your tax attorney, right? You would call a criminal defense attorney. But for some reason, there's not an understanding that if you want to advance women's rights, you need to work with specialists, people who understand how to apply the law with a gender perspective. So it's having a legal framework is not enough. The legal framework needs to be applied in a way that is taking into consideration the stereotypes that are applied to women generally in society and specifically by judges. So a lot of the work we're doing in these cases is thinking about how do you break down those gender stereotypes in the application of the law. And one of the cases I think that we've litigated over the years that really demonstrates that is a case called Gonzalez against Spain. And it's the case of a woman who was the victim of domestic violence in Spain. And she had been in this abusive relationship, and she had a 3-year-old daughter. And at one point when the abuser threatened her in front of her daughter and the situation got really bad, she was finally able to leave the family home. And she spent the next 3 or so years of her life fighting to get protection for herself and for her daughter, support. Like, she had like 30 different cases open in different courts around the state seeking this protection. And one of the things that was being argued in the cases was whether the father could see the daughter in unsupervised visits. So she wasn't saying that the father shouldn't see the daughter. She was just saying that those visits need to be supervised. And in one of these disputes, a judge, a woman judge, and it's important I say this because having a gender perspective isn't something that you have because you're a woman. It's something that like judges need to learn how to apply. Decided that to lift the requisite that the supervisions be that the visits be with supervision. And in one of those unsupervised visits, he killed his 6-year-old daughter and then committed suicide. The story is horrific. And unfortunately, it's not like an isolated event. And there is a lot of cases around the world in which part of the violence exercised against women is exercised against their children as a way to most hurt the women. And we, Angela came to us after she had finished litigating, looking for the responsibility of the state for the negligence of the judicial system. Came to us because she had lost at the national instances in Spain. And a woman with such clarity of thought about what she was looking for, and she was looking for justice for her daughter and non-repetition. And we took that case to the committee at the United Nations that is responsible for the convention that's responsible for the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. And the case was really about how those gender stereotypes blocked her access to justice. Because what happened, the stereotypes that were at play when she was seeking that protection were women are manipulative, women are not to be trusted. It's important to, like, the best interest is to normalize a family relationship regardless of the violence that might be happening. And it was all those stereotypes that didn't allow the judges to see the situation for what it was and to give the protection to Angela and to her daughter. And we won the case at the CEDAW committee, and they found Spain responsible. And it shifted the public debate around what it means to protect victims of domestic violence, including the protection of their children, and how to take into consideration the best interest of the child, how a child should be heard in that sort of circumstances. But I think that the case to me is really important because it highlights that gender stereotyping that takes place when women seek justice, and those barriers that need to be worked on regardless of what the legal framework is that's being applied.
Well, Kol hakavod to you and your team for winning that case, because that is, what a story.
And I think the merit really goes to her, which is like she's this amazing, powerful woman who's fighting for her rights, and then in doing so is representing women in similar situations.
As long as you brought up the UN, we had a question in the chat about whether you also work on the UN Security Resolution 1325, which you probably can articulate better than I could. So maybe I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. So it's Women, Peace, and Security, and We don't do direct work, but we do work in transitional justice as a topic. And so we do use the resolution and other standards that allow us to do this work. In terms of our working on transitional justice, which is like, when are you working, when there are situations in which there is a transition, either from conflict or dictatorship to democracy, like what we have done is we work to visibilize and bring forth how gender-based crimes impact, or what the crimes are that specifically impact women and girls, and to make sure that they're not left out and they're not seen as like an afterthought in these processes. And it's interesting because international criminal law, which was born after World War II, and maybe the first like famous trial in international criminal law are the Nuremberg trials. And one of the things I've thought about quite a bit is, what would women's rights have looked like if those Nuremberg trials had also taken into consideration the specific crimes that Jewish women faced during the Holocaust, which is now documented, not extensively documented, but is documented. And it was a missed opportunity. And then it took many decades until the tribunals were set up for the ex-Yugoslavia, and then in Rwanda, until there was, thanks to a very vibrant women's rights movement and some very progressive judges that sat on those courts, the recognition of things as like rape as a war crime, rape as torture, and how those situations need to be brought to light so that they don't go on and so there's no impunity for them. And we've worked specifically on those issues in national context, first in Guatemala, and then very dear to my heart in the processes that were taking place in Argentina for the specific crimes that happened in the clandestine centers in Argentina. And as I mentioned, my family left Argentina because of the dictatorship. So that work was especially meaningful to me as we worked with prosecutors and organizations to see how there were many trials that took place to hold responsible the dictators for the crimes that took place. And we worked to have those specific gender-based crimes included in some of those trials. And it was really, really important, because if not those crimes, they just remain invisible. And there's so much stigma around the sexual violence that women face that it often takes years for women to speak out about what has happened. And there's a lot of survivor guilt around it also. So yeah, some really interesting issues there.
I'm sure. I want to switch gears just a little bit. Obviously, the last 16 months have posed their own unique set of challenges. And you and I talked a little bit about, the correlation of world crises, and more specifically, like government reactions to world crises, and how those impact human rights. And I'd love to hear from you a little bit about, how the COVID pandemic has, how it has impacted your work. How have you seen those rights abuses being manifest in the work that you're doing?
Yeah. So unsurprisingly, well, one of the things that we knew before COVID, and we're luckily prepared to take on, was that when there are crisis situations, whether it's humanitarian crisis or conflict, there is unfortunately an increase in the rights violations that women and girls face. So we knew that was going to be the case. And as you said, it's not COVID itself that causes the increase in the rights violations, but the government reactions and a lot of the government, some of the lockdowns and the way that the governments responded to COVID. So just to give a couple of examples that I think are very clear. I think the one that everyone has been most aware of is, what happens when you have lockdowns and women are forced to be in cohabitation with their abusers without the possibility of accessing help. There was a tremendous increase in intrafamily domestic violence everywhere in the world. It was either seen through an increase in women seeking assistance or actually a complete decrease. And both of those things are evidence of an increase in the violence, unfortunately. And then there was the other things that happened is, the closing of borders. When borders are closed, women, when there is forced migration, the migration doesn't stop. But what happens is when borders are closed, that those migration routes become very risky because it's very difficult to cross borders. Maybe a good example of that is the exodus that has been happening for several years out of Venezuela because of the humanitarian crisis caused by the political turmoil in that country. So women and girls leaving Venezuela, are not doing it, out of choice. And so you close borders and it makes crossing the borders more risky, which increases risk of sexual violence. It increases risk of trafficking because women are in more vulnerable situations. And so the traffickers know that and then increase the number of women who are caught in these trafficking mafias to cross borders. And then the other consequence, which has been and continues to be tremendous, is the increase of lack of access to reproductive health, including abortion. So at the very beginning of COVID, the United Nations Population Fund at some point said, if the world continues to be in lockdown for, let's say, 6 months, we're going to have, in a 6-month period, approximately 7 million additional unintended pregnancies in the world. It's when you're talking about those kind of numbers, it's like hard to get your mind around it, right? And so what does that mean in terms of, access to reproductive health generally, unsafe abortions? What does that mean in terms of early pregnancies, rising rates of maternal mortality and morbidity? In Kenya, where we work, for example, there was a sharp increase in maternal mortality because there was a lack of information from the government about when you couldn't go out to a health center. So sometimes women who were pregnant and needed to go get services for childbirth weren't leaving, and it caused an increase in maternal mortality because there had been such severe crackdowns of people that were being out after curfew. And when you think about the fact that already around the world, the amount of women that die due to unsafe abortion, which is a completely preventable cause of death, to think about the increase in that worldwide and how invisible that is in the worlds in which we live, and how there's been this unfortunate conflation of COVID and right-wing populist governments plus anti-rights forces, kind of all coming together to take the opportunity. We think about opportunity to increase rights, and they take the opportunity to take away rights. And I think in the United States, we see that very clearly with the attack on abortion rights across the country. I think, unfortunately, it's a great example of that. It does also, of course, create a lot of opportunity. I tend to think of myself as an optimistic person. You can't work on human rights if you're not optimistic, right? Because it's, I think you and I discussed it, it's a little bit like it's having faith, because evidence tends to be the contrary when you look around, right? So you have to have faith that there's this capacity of human beings to improve and to respect human rights and dignity. So there's I think that's a fundamental, something that everyone who works on human rights has to have. But so, for example, there's been an increase in some places of women being able to access medical abortion, like telemedicine. And so that's an opportunity to increase the way women are accessing their rights. This is going to be fundamental in the United States in the next period of time, as laws get more restricted in different states, how women are able to access those rights through telemedicine, through medical abortion. And there is also something that has happened, which I think is really interesting, is that there's been this very clear understanding of what it means for there to be structural discrimination. And I think it was this conflation of COVID. And, I don't know if you remember this, but when COVID first started, everyone talked about, there was this brief period of time that people said, this is a disease that doesn't discriminate. I don't know if you heard people say that, because anybody could get sick.
Yeah.
But the truth of the matter is, and we know this, even though it's true that anyone gets sick, when you looked at the numbers across the world, it was people in poor communities, it's people with less access to health service. In the United States, it was Black and brown people who were dying at higher rates everywhere. And you still see this now. You think about vaccination rates, compare the United States to Kenya. Kenya has 1% of their population is vaccinated right now. And so the inequality that has been demonstrated by COVID and the reaction to COVID really has gotten global conversation started about what structural discrimination means. This in combination with all the conversations about racism, anti-racism, and equity have really brought to everyday conversations structural discrimination, which is a concept that I think has been difficult to explain before now. And this creates an amazing opportunity to make structural change with women and girls at the center of the solutions to the problems. So I'm a great believer that this the big risks also creates great opportunities for change that are really women and girl centered.
I agree. I think we're at a moment of reset in a lot of sectors, and I certainly hope that that will help accelerate some of the work that you're doing, in the feminist arena. I'm really interested to learn more about sort of the mechanics of how you work, because you're in so many parts of the world, in so many different countries, with so many different legal systems. So I'm interested to learn a little bit more about who is your team and how do you navigate all of those different legal systems that have very different procedures as well as laws?
Right. Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think when you're doing something for a long time, you forget what's not obvious. So Women's Inc. currently, we're a team of I think there's about 30 of us. And we are located, in 4 different regions. There's a couple of staff people who are actually based in the United States, although we don't do legal work in the United States. And, the majority of us are attorneys. So the way that it works is that we either, when we're in home countries where we have attorneys and we can do the litigation ourselves, we sometimes or very often do that, but we always do the litigation in partnership. And nothing that we do, I think any organization does, can be done by themselves. It would be such a small drop of sand it just wouldn't make any sense. And I think that also our theory of change, which is really based on this understanding that you take a case not only to set legal precedent, but to create public debate, which shifts the conversation and also allows you to tap into social movements that are demanding the change. And it all becomes a conversation, right? How courts or judges are implementing the laws is a conversation with what the executive is doing, what laws are being changed. And so it's a catalyst for that change, that the case becomes a legal platform, I think of it, like a legal advocacy platform in which others can be in conversation with. That said, you do need the attorneys that have the technical capacity to bring on the cases. So we either bring the cases on ourselves or we do through partnership. We also do a lot of work that is capacity strengthening around what it means to use a law strategically. So even though we do legal work, we spend a lot of our time preparing the environment, doing mappings, understanding what cases in front of what judges. How do you get human rights advocates to translate problems into rights violations? What does that mean? Is the judiciary ready? Are the judges ready? Do they have the will and do they have the capacity? And if they have the will and don't have the capacity, what can you do to build up that capacity in a specific jurisdiction to get the information to judges they need to be able to apply legal rights frameworks? So it looks different in different places, but it's always with attorneys who understand and know the procedure in the different countries and can take the technical work on, but always in partnership, both with legal and non-legal organizations that really take the cases outside of the courtroom walls, which is what really will make any change sustainable in time.
Yeah. And I love the way you talk about that as using the cases as a platform for advocacy. And obviously we've seen that in our own country around gay marriage, around reproductive rights, and how it can create a movement, which is so much more powerful. But, in that same vein, creating laws through legal reform is in a constant state of fluctuation, and ebbs and flows with who's sitting in the courts. And, we see this, in the United States, and I'm sure it's the same around the world. And so, what does that mean for your work in terms of like creating that long-term systemic change?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's, as I say to my team, working on these issues is a marathon, not a sprint. So I use a lot of running analogies because I love to run. And you've got to think about the changes and what you're working on in this long term, because it's a pendulum, right? And as you very much said, like the moment you win a case, you will then spend the rest of your life, the organization's life, making sure there's no rollbacks. And that is the case with everything we work on. In 2006, we won a case in Colombia that decriminalized abortion in that country. It was completely prohibited. We took a case to the Constitutional Court, and that was in 2006. And we have spent the rest of the time since then doing two things: working to make sure, how do you actually have access, even when the law is better, but then also how do you fight off the opposition, those anti-rights groups that are so prevalent everywhere in the world. They're constantly attacking, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and that attack is constant. I call it the opposition, anti-rights groups. I think people call it different things. They're really well organized. They're really well funded. They're global, but they talk local. So like they'll be based in Arizona, but when they're in, Uganda, they're talking about feminism as like a Western colonizing force. So they're very good at that, at doing that. And so always it's thinking about how to keep pushing the needle on the conversation and keeping an eye on what's happening with opposition. And as of late, we've started thinking a lot about what it looks like to be proactive and not just defensive. I think we and a lot of organizations around the world spend a lot of time on the defense on these issues, and to think about how to use things like the right to information proactively. We've been thinking about how to close crisis pregnancy centers. Because there needs to be some proactive work done around the opposition. And it's very difficult because, as I said, they're very well organized and very well funded. And they attack, like we're divided into groups, like we do women's rights or LGBTQ rights, like we're all divided into groups, but they attack everything that they think goes against what they consider to be like the natural order of things. So they have this widespread, themes that they're working on. So yeah, a marathon.
Well, and a constant battle, really. I mean, a marathon and a battle. And so, where do you draw your strength and your inspiration to keep going?
So I think before I answer your question, I want to say that I don't always feel strong and I don't always feel like it's possible to make a difference. I think sometimes I find myself, especially in this position I'm in, people think, oh, wow, like how do you, it's like you're so strong and you fight these battles and the cases you work on are so hard. But, I fall apart like everybody else and like lose hope like everybody else and feel like, and I think like when COVID hit was such a great example that I was just like, I saw the risk of women's rights, like just everything we've been fighting for decades. I just thought, oh my God, this is all going to fall apart. So I don't always have the strength, I think is what I want to say. I find the strength in the admiration I have for the women and girls that we represent. And I find it in how mad I get at injustice. I think like it makes me so mad that I think that is what fuels. I just can't, it's like wakes me up in the middle of the night. And I think that is something that, like I said at the very beginning, it's like, I can't control it. It's just like part of who I am. I have amazingly supportive and loving parents and amazingly supportive and loving children, and a very, very strong community of friends. And that is vital to be able to do this work, and to keep some sort of a balance and going forward.
Sure. And can you tell us a little bit about the role that the collective, JWFNY's collective, has played
Yes.
in your leadership, if at
Yes.
all?
Yes, so much so. And I think that when I was listening to Jamie do the introduction about what this idea behind the cohort, and I think for me, my participation in the cohort could not have come at a better time. I think that like the harder things are, the more important it is to have a space in which you are sharing with people in similar situations. I think, and I said this in my interview, when I was being interviewed for the cohort, being a CEO of an organization is very lonely. It's sometimes you just have stuff like you can't talk to anybody about for a lot of different reasons. And having a space where there are other women who are struggling with similar issues or different issues, but that are just the support and the understanding and the humanity around the cohort is really amazing. I said the other day as we were doing our closing, I feel that it's amazing to think that even though we haven't been able to meet in person because of COVID, like I feel like the work with the cohort has become part of my own personal journey. And I think that that's really quite amazing, given the fact that I haven't met anybody on the cohort in person. I'm hoping that'll happen soon. But it's really been, and that's the like the qualitative aspect of it. And then the topics that we work on and the discussions we have, they're timely, they're difficult. Having Ruth accompany us, it's been amazing. And I'm excited that it's not just a 1-year thing too, that it's got continuity, because I think it allows us to grow together through the journey. So it's been really amazing. I'm very grateful for for having the opportunity to participate in the cohort. It really is quite a privilege.
Well, and we're very proud to be supporting your work and look forward to watching your continued journey over the next few years. Before I sort of finish up, I see that we had a couple of questions from some of our listeners, which I want to make sure that I weave in here. First is sort of like a technical logistics mechanics question, I guess, is sort of, how do your cases come to you? Are you initiating your cases? Are individuals initiating your cases? Are they coming to you? How does that work?
Yeah. So maybe the person's not going to be happy with my answer. It depends. So it depends. Sometimes there is an issue that we know that there is violations occurring and that they're not being visibilized. I think maybe, for example, when we first started working on migration and trafficking in Spain, it was a completely invisible topic. Nobody even was talking about or understood that there were trafficking victims in Spain that were coming mostly from Sub-Saharan Africa, from Nigeria. And so in that case, we did a combination of doing some fact-finding research to get the information, and then from there started taking on cases and some test litigation to get the rights of trafficking victims recognized, which included having the ability to have a reflection period and not be deported. So in that case, we were looking for the cases, and we do so with service providers, so others who are providing services, so that we're in a network that works on these issues. Sometimes the cases come to us. I think the example I told you of the CEDAW case is actually I got a phone call like one very hot summer day, in which when I answered the phone, the woman who called me she's like, "What are you all doing in the office? Like nobody works in Spain in August." And I answered the phone. So sometimes the cases come to us. And then sometimes the cases come to us through our partners. So it depends on, whether it's and I think it's also changed over time. Now when we first started, we were looking for the cases, and now more of the cases come to us. I think as you become more known in the field, then it's both easier and harder, because then there's a lot of demand that can't always be met. So it really does depend a little bit on the case, the topic, and the country. Sorry, very unspecific
No, that
answer.
makes sense. Also, someone asked just a little bit about, roughly how big is your organization's budget, and how do you support yourselves? Where is most of your money coming from?
Yeah, so our budget is currently, I think, close to 3 million. It should be 5 million. That's my pitch as the CEO. We're at this really uncomfortable size as an organization, in which, we're like not the $1 million organization, not the $10 million organization. And we play this important role in the ecosystem of not being an INGO, like a big international organization, or a national organization. We're like this very specialized kind of boutique organization. And so that's where we're at. And we are funded by foundations and individuals. And very important to us, we do not accept any government funding from anybody, because we sue governments. And so it's a way of staying independent. So no European funding, no US aid funding of any sort. So yeah, that's our business model. Yeah.
That definitely makes sense. So, given the fact that we're coming off of this very difficult 18 months, and, and the fact that we talked about, your work being, an ongoing marathon, what is your outlook for the future? And, what gives you hope?
Yeah. So I think a number of things have happened in the past, I want to say 4 or 5 years, that have brought to light a very strong, very young, very feisty feminist movement globally. I want to say, and don't laugh, one of the best things that Trump brought us is such extreme misogyny that, again, just like the structural discrimination, it really did. It's part. I've thought about this a lot. I think it was one of the sparks. It was around the time of the Me Too movement and Trump, and this collective rising. It was a collective breaking of the silence, is how I think of it. And that collective breaking of silence, in which I think every woman, I've never been in a space with a group of women, and I've done this a lot of times, in which I say, and I ask, think about whether you sometime in your life have, suffered some sort of violence, harassment, anything. I actually have never spoken to a woman who said, nope, never. That's never happened to me. Whether it's you were inappropriately touched on a bus, inappropriate comment, a boss that stepped over the line, a professor that stepped over the line, or from the range of the issues that we work on of extreme violence. I think all of us know that, all women and girls across the globe know that. And at the same time, we know we live in this world in which legal frameworks recognize women's rights and non-discrimination. And so there's this moment in which it's oh, wait a second, that's not enough. And this breaking of the silence, and the Me Too, the marches, this understanding that movement needs to be inclusive, that there's not one feminism, there's feminisms, and there's room and voices for all of them. And the young women, I see that next generation of women, and they are coming up so strong and so ready for the fight. There's no going back on that. And I think that's the present, and that's the future. And that gives me a lot of hope. And that movement is also accompanied by amazing men which is also part of the future of it being everybody's battle, because equality is for everybody, right? Because breaking stereotypes frees everybody, men and women, and gender nonconforming folks, everybody.
I agree. And as a mother who's raising one of those feisty young women, it gives me hope as well. And I think it's a real nod to our foremothers, right? It is their legacy that keeps getting stronger and stronger and stronger with every generation. So that's a wonderful thought to hold in our hearts as we close out our conversation. It was so lovely talking with you today. And I'm going to invite our CEO, Jamie Ellen Black, to come back and join us.
I'm back. Thank you so much, Viviana, for taking the time to share your wisdom and this extraordinary story and your journey with all of us. And Rachel, of course, thank you for leading the conversation. Viviana, I so agree. I learned so much from our young feminists, the women, the men, the non-binary individuals. It blows my mind. I love having my colleagues at JWFNY are much younger than I am, and they are always teaching me something. Like I'm always learning something, being like, oh my goodness, I forgot how to do that. So I love that. It's great. And we're everyone, we are so inspired by Viviana's leadership and the Women's Link Worldwide's work. And we hope that you are as well. I can't imagine you'd watch this and not be. Before we go, we like to leave you with a few actions you can take. Links will be in the chat and we'll email them to you tomorrow, as we always do. By directly supporting Women's Link, you help secure human rights for the women furthest from accessing justice. You can join the Women's Link family by signing up for their newsletter and following them on social media. Connect with Viviana directly on social media to hear about her leadership journey and to read her many thoughtful articles on women's rights around the world. You can also find that on their website, which is a really interesting website. I learned a lot from reading it. Mark your calendars for August 5th at noon. We go all the way through the summer when we'll speak with Michal Avera Samuel, the community shlicha at Jewish Columbus. Michal will share her passion for Israel education, her experience emigrating from Ethiopia to Israel as a child, and her deep commitment to justice. We'll send you a link tomorrow to register right away. And if you missed any of the last 11 conversations, the recordings are on our website. So thank you again to Viviana and to Rachel, and thank you all for being with us today. I am grateful to be here, healthy, happy, and I wish all of you the rest of your summer to be healthy, happy, and happy birthday, Rachel Weinstein. Thanks, everyone.